Good afternoon. I'm Irvin Wainwright, founder and director of Higher Ground Mental Wholeness Center in Rockford, Illinois. I just want to give you a quick introduction to a book that I'm working on. It's entitled America's Hidden Treasure, which explores the social, psychological, and anthropological work that David Walker had actually performed. Has never received credit for, and gives a really good background to the mental illness history of African Americans in this country, because we do have a history of mental illness that we're not aware of. So Walker, I'm going to go real quick through this. Walker uses a term, miserable and misery. He uses those interchangeably, same term, to speak of the social, physical, mental condition of the African Americans during this particular period of time. He used a term and he said that we were among the most miserable people on the planet. And he used the term miserable, and if you just do a little bit of work in understanding what he meant, he was referring, when he said miserable, it referred to the emotional, psychological condition of African Americans at that time. For example, Walker realized that African American women experienced high rates of physical and sexual abuse at the hands of another group of people. That produced a particular trauma, distrust within the female population, that became generational, because as she was violated, she had no out, she had no one to turn to, she had no one to depend on for protection. So she internalized that pain, and created a genre of distrust within that female that was subsequently passed down through tradition, verbally, and sometimes even through actions. The trauma was passed down, where a lot of the women began to feel that men were not trustworthy. You can't trust men. There's an automatic red flag that most men are sexually deviant, and even though you may love a particular man, you are always suspicious of his behaviors around his daughter and your daughter. Not in all cases, but in those cases where the trauma is proliferated. And so that you go into that relationship with a failed system of trust because of the generational mental illness that's flowed down to you. And so the other thing was, on the other hand, you had the African American male who was emasculated, his male identity obliterated, his protection status and the relationship annihilated. So he was emasculated, and he internalized that, learned self-helplessness, and he began to project that anger out on the closest thing to him, which was his family. And so that generational instability flowed down through generations back. And yet, here and today in our society, as African American people, we are still experiencing those mental illnesses. There's a book called Laying My Burdens Down by Dr. Passant and Dr. Alexander, which they identified a conglomerate of mental illnesses that we experience, and it was called the post-traumatic slave syndrome. And that was sort of like a hodgepodge of all the mental, emotional, and social ills that we experience as a people today, as a group of people, as African Americans. So one of the things that we had to deal with was the fact that we looked at mental illness as something that was taboo, something we didn't want to talk about, something we don't want to discuss in our own communities. While it was running rampant and destroying our families, it was taboo. We didn't want to talk about it. So mental illness became, in our societies, a luxury, something that, well, if you have the money to do it, you might want to do it, or I don't need this. Our dependence on spirituality became proliferated. So all those things began to occur because even during the Walker's pill, his information was largely ignored simply because he was black, not because it wasn't correct, Not because it didn't hold any scientific value, but because he was an African American. And so our mental wholeness and our mental states were always relegated to the furthest realms of life. We never even thought about it. Alcoholism, drug addiction, suicide, physical abuse, emotional abuse, traumas continue to run rampant in our communities because when we want to talk about our mental wholeness, it's a taboo syndrome. It's time that we break the chains. It's time that we become aware of our mental status, our emotional status, to save ourselves from mental destruction. This is a case for David Walker's Appeal, and I'm Irvin Wainwright, founder, director of Higher Ground Mental Wholeness Center, Rockford, Illinois.